Thank you ever so much to the organisers. I feel quite honoured to be part of an esteemed panel and to be here talking with you all this evening. So in my presentation, I'm just going to be going over perhaps some complementary remarks to the points that Liz and Sophia have already made in discussing Islamophobia in Europe. So I really want to reflect on what Islamophobia is, the ways in which it manifests in Europe, the points of potential convergence and divergence that we see across the continent, and the ways in which it's mainstreamed across Europe and in the UK. So in doing so, I'm drawing on two significant pieces of work in which I've been involved, one of which was a European Commission funded project where we looked at both the nature of Islamophobia, but also best practices in countering Islamophobia that are already being employed by key stakeholders in communities. And in that study, we looked at 8 case studies. So we looked at France, Germany, Belgium, the UK, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Portugal, and Greece. It's always a mouthful to try and remember those. Really, we had some, Western European, but also potentially cases that are seen more as on the fringes in the southern areas where austerity, etc., have perhaps been more keenly felt, although arguably looking at the UK now, I'm not sure we could make that same claim. We did this research up to sort of 2019 when we published a book on it. And I'm also drawing on a book, an edited volume that I've just published in May this year, where I look at gendered Islamophobia, and it's a collection with other scholars in the area. So in my work, I typically use the APPG definition that Liz mentioned, which describes Islamophobia as a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. I feel that this is increasingly adopted by many of us in the field and a number of kind of key actors as well, in that it helps us understand the ways in which Islamophobia transcends people, practice, and place. And it's not really about being Muslim, it's about being perceived as Muslim. In terms of the ways in which this functions, although this is taken from the UK context, it's very much applicable in the European context as well, I would argue. The ways in which we see Islamophobia manifesting across Europe, again, very similar to the UK. We have the interpersonal experiences like the violence that we saw during the UK riots, evident in those hate crime statistics that are often the tip of the iceberg, but also factors such as denial of service. So we, in that study, came across women who were told you can't get on the bus here, public transport, great Europe kind of nationalised systems that it has that we can only look at enviously in the UK. But, a public service that they couldn't access because they wore hijab. It's completely unlawful, but it's very much normalised by some of these political narratives and press narratives that we're seeing, and really this sort of cyclical nature of the political, policy, legislative element, and the way in which it feeds into the interpersonal acts of violence, exclusion, and denial of services. So it's very similar there. In our study, we looked at sort of the nature of Islamophobia and tried to really map what was going on across these 8 quite different contexts. And really we found that whilst there are contextual specificities, so for example in Greece there might be greater emphasis on Greco-Turkish history and Greco-Turkish relations, whereas in the Czech Republic, where there's almost an absence of a Muslim population, so no real encounters with Muslims, or very limited encounters with Muslims, you see these points of similarity. And we would say that in this study we found that Islamophobia was characterized by this notion of Muslim threat. Demographic threat, the Great Replacement theory that Sophia mentioned, and whether that's sort of through the perceived hyperfertility or hyperfecundity of Muslims, but also proselytization, that if Muslims are seen, they will automatically force other people to become Muslims. So therefore their presence must be a concealed and discreet presence. That Muslims pose an alleged cultural threat. This is ideological, that they have parallel practices in society, and that they wish to enforce these parallel practices on the wider white majority society. Muslims in our research were seen as inherently violent and barbaric, echoed in some of that gendered dimension element that Sophia mentioned around kind of, it's almost like Muslims can't help themselves, that they act in misogynist or culturally and physically violent ways, that they favour gender inequality, allegedly apparent in Muslim women's dress and it being allegedly forced upon them, and that they are inherently and kind of at their very root unassimilable, and they will forever be the problematic other. And this was something that we saw real convergence across the continent. So while you have the specificities, there's this coming together in this idea that Muslims are threatening, and therefore this threat must be dealt with. In terms of the mainstreaming of Islamophobia, we very much found this within context and between contexts. And the far right is absolutely central, but this mainstreaming is functioning on and relying on the banalization or the normalization of of Islamophobia across Europe and the UK. And in some of the work I discuss in the edited handbook on gendered Islamophobia, I start to draw on this idea of liberal Islamophobia, and that perhaps giving us some of the linguistic tools to start to explain the kind of various ways in which the Islamophobia is becoming normalized. And I use Mondin and Winter's work here. So the liberal Islamophobia trope draws very much on and comes together with, you'll see a meeting point with far-right Islamophobia, particularly along gendered lines, but it's seen as a common sense response. So as part of our liberal society and our protection of democracy, we must discipline Muslimness to ensure that our kind of liberal ways of doing and being in the West are protected. There's a quote from Mondin and Winter that I find quite helpful. They talk about a widespread and normalized criticism of the essentialized Muslim threat for its hatred of our liberal freedom and tolerant societies. They continue, the ways in which liberal Islamophobia is articulated is through, in one way, the evocation of gender rights in the West, particularly around banning the hijab and the burqa in the name of emancipation. So this is perhaps one of the tools that we could use along understanding the hard right and far right articulations of racism to try and perhaps broaden that lens and understand the way in which the left is also becoming increasingly central through these liberal articulations and it being a sort of almost common sense response. And one of the ways in which in my own work I explain this liberal common sense articulation of Islamophobic practice is through looking at the case study of France, where you have bans like in 2004, the ban through the Loi Stasi on headscarves in schools that has been replicated across Europe, Belgium being one of them, or the Loi anti-niqab, so the face veil ban implemented first in France in 2010, followed swiftly by Belgium in 2011, and Austria, and debates in Switzerland. It was almost like a domino effect. So this is potentially one of the ways. And the assumption there was that Muslim men are violent and that they are forcing Muslim women to cover this way. When in fact in France, when this ban was implemented, there were around an estimated 300 women that wore. For an enormous Muslim community like that, that's really quite insignificant. But perhaps it's about generating political narrative, generating press narrative to continue this myth of a Muslim essentialized threat. And in these sorts of bans in France, we see the evocation of women's rights, but also Orientalist tropes around Muslim male barbarity, Muslim women's submissiveness, to continue and legitimize or pseudo-legitimize. And we see this kind of recycling of historic colonial tropes to maintain and normalize the far right and the left wing, increasingly left wing. And also kind of looking at from the far right to the left, we see some of the paradoxes sort of through ideas like feminationalism, where you have the evocation of feminist tropes by other women to limit another group of women's freedoms. And this kind of paradoxical feminist evocation is not problematized in ways in which we really ought to see it being done if we're thinking about genuine equality and sort of fairness across the board. How am I doing for time? I think conclude. Okay, I'll wrap up then with my concluding remarks. So, thinking about the 32 steps to togetherness and also the IIR report, I think Islamophobia in Europe is not dissimilar to what we're seeing in the UK, and therefore I'd say there are best practices. There is a globalizing far right, far left kind of spectrum of Islamophobia that requires, I think, further investigation, further analysis. And I think it's cross-political, and that's quite important to highlight in addition to this far left. The road is long, and I think we'll kind of have to continue on our anti-racist fight. But thank you ever so much.